There's something dreamlike about FPV, and after watching flight videos on Instagram for hours, I knew I had to learn how. One of the best ways to do that, Tinyhawk and Velocidrone. Now, if you're someone who's interested in FPV, or maybe you already are an FPV pilot, you probably know that this Tinyhawk and the simulator combination is a popular way to kind of get into the hobby. So now that I've been doing it for like 2 weeks, I thought it'd be interesting to give my perspective on how the Tinyhawk and simulator combination has helped me fly, along with my progress that I've made so far. So I wanted just to frame this video up quickly before actually jumping in and talk about my background, which is primarily in photography. So I did that for a few years, did some senior photos and things like that, and kind of have an artistic background. I did a lot of drawing and stuff. Recently got the EOS R and wanted to get into video production, which is where I knew that I'd want to get a drone, just because of kind of the diversity of shots that you can get with a drone. And so kind of went down the typical rabbit hole of looking at kind of the entry-level drone. So you're thinking like a Mavic Mini or something like that. And you know, there's pros and cons to each. So thinking about the pros of the more, call it traditional drones, like your Mavic Air, Mavic Mini, those kind of things. First of all, you just start with the quality of the image and video that you're gonna get is very high. You've seen people using these cameras and these drones for multiple years, and they're kind of tried and true options. Second, it's just gonna be cheaper. So, you know, the Mavic Air coming in at, I don't even know, let me see. Mavic Air 2, $800, Mavic Mini, $500. You know, both of those options are likely gonna be much cheaper than if you're getting into the FPV hobby. The Tinyhawk is really only gonna be like $160 all in, and it's kind of the ready to fly bundle, which I'll talk about more later in the video. But overall, when you start getting into kind of plug and play drones where you're gonna be having to buy your own receiver, have your own controller, buy your own batteries, all that kind of stuff, the $450 of the Mavic Mini 2 is definitely gonna come in at a lower price point. One of the other major pros that I was looking at when considering the difference between both of these two is just the ease of use. So I've never owned or flown a Mavic drone before, but from my understanding, it's a really simple process and the learning curve isn't too high. Whereas when you're thinking about something like FPV, the learning curve is much steeper, people spending countless hours trying to learn how to fly and perfect the craft. But with that, you know, comes some of the cons of the more traditional drones, which is just the ability that you have with them. When I say that, I mean kind of the ability that in FPV, obviously, you can be much more dynamic. You're flying in acro mode. There's different things that you can do with the drone, like dive straight down a building or do flips or spins and things like that, which you won't be able to do on kind of the more traditional Mavic type drones. So I tried to understand both the pros and cons, did some Googling, and went down both rabbit holes to see which I thought would be better and ultimately more fun for me. And after looking at some of the other YouTubers fly their drones, it just seemed like they're having so much fun when they're actually flying, whereas you never really see videos of people flying the Mavic and saying that they're having a blast doing it. Now, people might have that experience, but FPV seems like it kind of leans more in that direction. So ultimately decided to kind of take the jump into FPV and made my first purchase, the Tinyhawk. So I did a ton of research, did my Googles, and decided that I wanted to make the jump into FPV. Now, the easiest way that I found to do this is to go the Tinyhawk route. It's basically a ready-to-fly kit. So you're not gonna have to worry about getting a controller, a receiver, soldering, or any of that stuff. You just really get that box. This box, which really comes with everything you need. Comes with, you got the drone. Step one, obviously you need that, and then you have your charging cable, which is going to help charge the battery for your headset, along with the battery for the actual drone itself. Then you've got the controller. You've got this little single cell battery charger that it comes with. You've got your headset, obviously. Some spare props. And lastly, the 1-cell battery itself. So one of the reasons that this is one of the more popular entryways into FPV is just because of the price point in comparison to other kind of drones that you would get. So for all of the stuff that I just mentioned, I paid $165 on Amazon, and I think You can get it for a little bit cheaper maybe on Get FPV, but they're probably on back order, at least they were the last time that I checked. But if you compare this price to something else, kind of just a standalone plug and play drone, which is likely around $150 and up, this is a great deal. And it's great because it kind of gives you the feeling of what it would be like to fly maybe a little bit larger of a quad, and also just kind of get you used to the handling and different controls that it takes to understand flying FPV. Now, contrary to most other people, I actually had a little bit of issue getting my drone binded to the controller, but ultimately got that taken care of and was super excited to fly this for the first time. Now, let me preface my first flight video by just saying I thought that I was gonna have the easiest time getting into FPV. I thought that, I have a history of sports and athletics, so my hand-eye coordination is pretty good. Additionally, like if you've seen the controller, it looks really similar to like an Xbox controller or something, which I grew up playing video games and stuff all day long, so I thought I would just be able to kind of waltz in and have a handle of it pretty simply, pretty quickly. And I realized, as you're about to see, that was not the case at all.
50 kilos.
Yeah. Were you swinging by and started first?
And that realization ultimately led me to figuring out the best way to practice, which leads me to Velocidrone. So for those that don't know, Velocidrone is one of many FPV simulators where you can go in and practice on kind of just different maps, and I think it's also used for racing too, which I haven't done yet, but I would imagine that that's really fun to do as well. So like I mentioned, there's a few different simulators out there, but Velocidrone seemed to be one of the more popular options, and essentially was just the one that some of the other YouTubers that I watch recommended, so I went that route. So I spent a few hours in Velocidrone, just kind of learning and trying to get a sense of what was up and down, because honestly I was a little bit disoriented, if you couldn't tell based off my first flight. So I spent some time in there just trying to get a feel for the controls and things like that, and ultimately decided to take the Tinyhawk out again, and I flew it outside, which likely isn't the greatest idea in hindsight, but yeah, I mean, it's certainly fun, and you can see the kind of the clip that I got. And eventually, the best gift of all. Flight. Bro, this thing's high as deuce. One thing that I would point out that I learned really quickly after the first couple of flights really is how fun flying FPV actually is. Because when you're watching some of your favorite pilots on YouTube or Instagram or whatever, you can't really get a feel for how much fun they're having behind the goggles. But it really is an adrenaline rush that you can't really describe until you've actually flown one. You're really just kind of locked in, and it's almost like an out-of-body experience because of how close attention you have to pay if you're trying to get close to things and maneuver around different objects. But that's something that if you're watching your favorite YouTuber or Instagram pilot, you don't really get a sense for. So fast forward that through a ton more crashes. Landing on a roof.
He's close.
Keaton lost his drone on the roof. So he is currently climbing up this tree. Look at him.
This is awesome.
And eventually a broken flight controller and get to today. point, I've spent around 15 hours in Velocidrone, kind of just practicing, and I've actually found it to be pretty useful just to find maps like you see here and just practice slow, controlled flight through various different tracks, opposed to kind of just getting on, messing around and trying to do cool freestyle tricks, especially for someone who's kind of just trying to learn. I think being controlled and being really strategic about your practice can help you improve a lot faster. I've also done like 5 or so hours of practice just flying the Tinyhawk around inside and outside, and now since coming back to my apartment, the video you saw flying around my amenities floor, there's a bunch of different stuff and obstacles in there that can help me practice that I wasn't able to find kind of outside in my yard. And for someone who's just getting into FPV, I think it's really important to kind of distinguish the differences between flying in the simulator and flying the actual kind of Tinyhawk and other drones in real life. And that main difference is just the floatiness that you'll see, at least in Velocidrone. Your quad in real life is going to drop much faster, at least I've noticed, than in Velocidrone. In Velocidrone, you can let off the throttle all the way and you'll kind of just float your way down to the ground, whereas in real life, if you let off the throttle all the way, at least from what I've seen, when you're flying fairly low to the ground, you're just going to hit the ground immediately, crashing yourself. And I think just learning those different nuances between flying in Velocidrone and getting practice on the Tinyhawk has been really helpful to learn. Another important difference I think to call out is just the differences in crashing. So if you crash in Velocidrone in the simulator, there's no consequences, which is obviously the reason for actually getting the simulator. But you're not getting that same adrenaline rush and feeling as you are flying around a real quad, because you don't have any money at risk in the simulator. Whereas in real life, if you crash your drone, you know, with the Tinyhawk, maybe it's only $100, but to replace it, there is something there. And you're also just kind of more locked in because there might be people around, or, I mean, it's just a real life scenario, versus in the simulator, you can kind of just be a little bit more laid back if you want, because there's no consequences. So now that I've kind of flown the Tinyhawk for a few weeks, I wanted to give a beginner's kind of impressions of it and just some of the pros and cons that you might see, especially as you kind of get some weeks under your belt and realize you might need to start making the step up into a more plug and play, larger size drone. First, I would say the Tinyhawk is great for beginners because it gives them a way to kind of get in and get practice quickly for a pretty cheap price relative to the other options. You also have a really small quad, so you don't have to worry about hurting anyone or breaking anything in your house for the most part if you're flying around. This thing can also take a beating, so like you saw, I flew this thing straight into the wall, I've flown it into a roof, I've flown it into the ground full speed, I've flown it kind of everywhere and crashed it everywhere, and this thing definitely can take a beating. Now I did break my flight controller, the gyroscope, after about 2 weeks of heavy crashing, but I think that if you spend more time in the simulator than I did, you shouldn't have that problem. Now, depending on how quickly and how obsessed, frankly, you get with the hobby, you'll notice that there are certainly some downsides to kind of the more entry-level Tinyhawk ready-to-fly bundle that you get, and you might notice fairly quickly. The first of these downsides that I notice is that there isn't really a great way to record your flights with the ready-to-fly bundle. Now, there's certainly things that you can buy, a video transmitter and things, and solder it on to your flight controller, but if you're just someone newer to the hobby like myself, you're gonna find that it's really tough to record your flights, and I'll show you a picture of how I kind of recorded mine, but this definitely makes it harder to fly because you're just looking at the LCD screen on your camera versus actually having the goggles on and getting a much wider field of view. Also, there's going to be lag on your camera, which you likely wouldn't get if you're just wearing the goggles, so that's another consideration, and it makes it a lot tougher to get your best flights when you're recording it, which are likely the ones that you'd ultimately want to show to your friends and family. Another thing that I've noticed that was a little bit tough is just trying to fly outside. Now, it certainly can be done, and at higher speeds it might even be recommended, but I live in Chicago, and trying to fly this tiny little thing outside where the winds are at like 15 miles an hour at a given time, it's just impossible to kind of get any control with this because it's so small. So the pro is that you can be inside and fly inside and get a ton of practice, but The con is that it's just so small, you're just going to be getting whipped around by the wind. So overall, I think the Tinyhawk and Velocidrone or simulator combination are great for beginners who are just looking to kind of figure out if they want to pursue FPV as a hobby or not. It's a great option for those people. But if you get obsessed with it, like I've kind of been, and realize that you want to get a larger quad so you can start learning more, throw a GoPro on there and things like that, record your flights, you're going to have a much tougher time and you're going to be trying to scale up a lot faster. So the next thing you'll have to buy is probably a controller, some LiPo batteries, LiPo battery charger, and all of those fun things. But this gives you the option to understand if that's a plunge and financial investment that you want to make. So now that I'm obsessed with this little thing and realize that I love flying FPV, I need to do some more research and figure out what the next steps are to kind of help me reach my FPV goals and the milestones of ways that I would like to fly. And from what I've seen so far, it's not going to be cheap.